What were the ramifications of the Puritan Reformation? Now, although some may claim that the Puritan Reformation had little impact other than a couple of changes in leadership in England and then the execution of Charles I, of course, the Puritan Reformation had large ramifications across religious, cultural, and the political spectrums. So, what exactly does this mean? It had ramifications across the religious spectrum in that it created lasting bitterness in branches of the Reformation in England. It had a cultural impact, and it led to the creation of vice laws, the separation of church and state, and a strong emphasis on education. And it had a political impact. The Puritans favored republicanism, totalitarianism, and these had a major influence on the American and French revolutions. Let us start by looking at the religious impact of the Puritan Revolution. But to understand how this happened, we have to take a look at the history of the Puritans. Now, with Henry VIII, when he split away from the Catholic Church and founded the Anglican Church, the church still remained mostly Catholic in all but name. It still had the same hierarchy and theology, it's just that the new head of the church was the king rather than the pope. But then under Elizabeth, she changed it so that there was a Calvinist theology, however it kept the Catholic liturgy. Now this was a reasonable compromise, which meant that everybody hated it. This split the people into two main groups. The more traditional that were either fine with the way it was somewhat, or those that were completely against it and wanted it to be completely Calvinist. When James I became king, he tried to bridge the gap between these different factions by publishing a Bible, the King James Version. However, although a great way in unifying the Bible of England, was unsuccessful in creating peace between the different religious branches. And ultimately, conflict between these two groups grew so much that in 1642, war broke out. In the end, the Puritans won, and in 1649 they executed the King Charles I. And by 1653, Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell had taken over, leading to the completion of the Puritan Revolution. But how does this lead to a religious impact? Well, this was a full-out civil war. When there's a civil war of any sort, the two sides are not friends after the war ends. And this was no different here. The Cavaliers, the people that were more conservative and Catholic, they hated the Puritans, unsurprisingly, and they were hated by the Puritans as well. But this divide and war led to lasting divides that would spread throughout history. And the desolation of the Cavaliers during the Puritan Reformation was so great that, quote, this unparalleled butchery made the Cavaliers fly from their native country, as if from a place infected with the plague, from Colonel Norwood. He is saying that the violence was so bad that they fled from their country as though there was a plague, as in the worst thing in the world was happening, which, to some extent, it was. And where did they go? They went to America. However, sometime later, the Cavaliers were able to regain control in England. This meant that the Puritans were now the ones under threat. And where did they flee? Well, they also fled to America. But instead of fleeing to the south like the Cavaliers, they fled further north, which led to the north and south bits. That led to the divide of the north and south in America. But beyond this religious impact and lasting divide it caused, there's also many major cultural impacts. And to understand this, we must understand the Puritan beliefs. They had what we call a tulip theology. It's an anagram, and the A is for total depravity. Man has no free will. U is for unconditional election. God has chosen who he wants to go to heaven, and nothing and no one can change that. They have limited atonement, that Christ only died for the elect. Irresistible grace, and that if God wants you to go to heaven and you're one of his elect, you can do nothing to refuse his grace. And lastly, the perseverance of saints. Once you are elected by God, nothing can change that. But so, understanding this theology of the Puritans, we might be able to better understand what happened with why they were. Understanding the theology of the Puritans helps us understand the cultural changes that they brought about. Because they viewed everybody as predestined, that they thought had a large amount of introspection and individualism. Why was this? Well, because of their predestination, they were constantly wondering, am I good enough? Has God chosen me to go to heaven? And as such, they were constantly trying to live godly lives through self-discipline and hard work. If God would reward them in doing this, that was a sign to them that they were clearly elect by God. And this was another factor in that the result of this was that they had a lot of money. They wouldn't spend it on worldly things or go wasting it about. If they did, that would be a clear sign that they were not elect by God. As a result, quote, Calvinist believers were psychologically isolated. Their distance from God could only be precariously bridged by unstinting, purposeful labor, end quote from Max Weber. He's saying that the Calvinists were always worried about whether or not they were good enough and were constantly trying to work harder to show that they were. But what real cultural impact does that have? Well, there were a couple major reasons. One is they placed a large value on education. They strongly believed that everybody needed to read the Bible for themselves to understand their theology and why they believed what they did. Without a strong view of education, this clearly wouldn't happen. But perhaps a more interesting cultural impact was the implementation of vice laws. Now, before the Puritans, most laws were mostly set out to govern what happens when a man interacts with another person. For example, if I were to punch somebody, I would be punished accordingly. If I were to steal something, then again, there was a punishment for that. What I did in relationship to myself didn't matter. I could behave however I wanted so long as it didn't affect anybody else. But vice laws tried to control that. Remember, the Puritans were trying to live as holy lives as possible. And so they wanted the government to regulate what was going on in people's individual lives so that they would be able to live more holy lives. However, somewhat contradictory, this does not mean they supported the combination of church and state. In fact, they were opposed to it. And this also goes back to their theology in that they were against church hierarchy. They were Calvinists and thus Protestants and were against the Catholic hierarchy, which meant that they didn't want anybody, such as a government or a pope, in charge of the church. That didn't mean they didn't want the government to impose the moral standards of the church, shown through, again, the vice laws. And so, in the end, the vice laws and the education and the vast amount of introspection and individualism caused a cultural impact by the Puritan Revolution. And lastly, there was also a major political ramification, mostly in that of the American and French Revolutions. Quote, Calvin also believed that the state should secure distributive justice, doing its best to eliminate gross inequalities in the material status of its members. And that's Donna Campbell saying that, but what her point is that Calvin and Calvinists were against gross income inequalities. For example, if someone was being taxed without representation, that would be a major problem. Or perhaps there was a rich upper class that had almost all of the political power and wealth without being the majority of the people. If those things that sound familiar, they should. It's because those were the main reasons that both the American and French revolutions were fought. And as a result, we can see the direct ties of the Puritan Reformation to the American and French revolutions. But the ramifications go much deeper than that, especially in the American political system. Now, the American political system was largely influenced by the Puritans. Our three branches of government, for example, were because the Puritans didn't want one person or group of people in charge. They had many poor experiences with Parliament back in England. Their vice laws, for example, were another thing that America had in its early days and were prominent, once again, because of the Puritans. And perhaps most importantly, the Mayflower Compact, made by Puritans, was the birth of American democracy and led to the idea of popular sovereignty. In conclusion, the political, religious, and cultural ramifications of the Puritan Revolution cannot be understated. They had lasting impacts that are still seen today in America and throughout the rest of the world.